My name is Kathryn Kidder. Today is June 27th, 2020. I'm here with Gerald Kidder, Jerry Kidder. For the transcriber, can you please say and speak your name?
Gerald Kidder. I'm nicknamed Jerry.
And would you please spell your name?
Geraldkidder. And
Thank you.
Jerry is Jerry.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us and willing to record today this oral history. Since this history is your story, I would like to start with some biographical information before we go into our subject of the day, which is your activities with the American Society of Sugarcane Technologists, Florida Division. So to begin, can you tell me where and when you were born?
I was born January 2nd, 1940 in Leonville, Louisiana.
Okay, and your parents were?
Wade Kidder and Sybil Carrier Kidder.
Okay. Would you spell their first names, please?
Wade, W-A-D-E, and Sybil is a little different spelling, but she spelled it S-I-B-Y-L. And the second, her maiden name was Carrier, which is C-A-R-R-I-E-R-E.
Okay. Were you born at home or in a hospital?
I was born at home. It was the home of, at the home of my maternal grandmother in Leonville.
And do you know the name of the doctor or midwife who delivered you?
Yes, his name was Dr. Pavy, P-A-V-Y.
Thank you. And where did your parents come from?
My mother was from Leonville, Louisiana, and my dad was from Arnaudville, which was just a few miles down the bayou.
Can you tell us your grandparents' names and where they were from?
Yes. The paternal grandfather was Jules Kidder, J-U-L-E-S, and my grandmother was Manette Mesh Kidder. And then my mother's father was Cyprian Carrier, and his wife was Dea Mallet Carrier.
Thank you. You have a good memory. And where did you grow up?
I grew up in Opelousas, which was just about 8 or 10 miles from Leonville, but that's where my parents were living when I was born and when I grew up. And for the first 10 years of my life, we were in the city of Opelousas. And then at age 10, we bought a small farm outside of Opelousas, only a few miles outside of town. So I was basically from Opelousas. I am from Opelousas originally.
Can you describe the homes that you lived in?
The first house we lived in Opelousas was a shotgun rental home. Had 3 rooms, 4, I guess, if you counted the washroom. And it was, and then so that was a pretty rudimentary house. My dad was a carpenter, and he rented that house and had fixed it up better than the other rental houses in the row. I don't know how much more you want to know about that. We had gas heat, natural gas heat, and electricity, of course, and running water. We did not have indoor plumbing until the last few months that we lived there, and then the indoor plumbing was brought in. We then had a toilet in. When we moved to the farm, we first lived in a very small, it had been a tenant farmer's house, and we lived in that for 4 years, and then accumulated enough money and a little inheritance money from the part of my mother, and we then my dad built with help from relatives, built the house that around we repaired, but basically rebuilt the house while we continued to live in it. We built a 3-bedroom house, and I lived there, and my parents lived there for the rest of their lives.
How old were you when that
Excuse
happened?
me, I lived there until I went to college, and then after that, I basically lived. I mean, I only went home for vacations and the like, and then after I graduated, I never lived in Opelousas again. So, you were asking?
How old you were when you moved to that house?
I was essentially 10. We moved in December, and I turned 10 in January.
Can you tell me something about your earliest memories as a child, your early memories? The kind of childhood you had?
Where do you start? We had, I was an only child until I was 5. My only sister was born when I was 5. We're 5 years and 1 week difference in age. And don't remember a whole lot about the early childhood. Earlier days. Well, I remember some things. It was during World War II, of course. And so I have memories of that time. I remember a blackout during a practice blackout where the lights dimmed to that so that the filaments were just glowing. I remember occasionally seeing blimps, because Opelousas is only about maybe 70 or 80 miles straight line from the Gulf of Mexico, and there was a big major U.S. blimp base in Houma, and so I guess it was big deal when we could see the blimps. The other thing I remember about the wartime was that just down the street from where we lived in Opelousas was a major sweet potato dehydrating plant. That was a war plant. They were dehydrating sweet potatoes for shipping to the troops. So all the employees were considered part of the war effort, and I had an uncle and an aunt who were working there, and I remember feeling very proud one day when they, as part of the what do you call it, the patriotic effort that was being pumped up all the time, that they came marching down the street all in their white uniforms, marching down Cherry Street and up to that plant, and there was my uncle and aunt in there. So that was a big deal. And that was but other things, the other thing that I remember about the house, it was a shotgun house. Means the 3 rooms are all lined up one behind the other, and but the front end of the house was up on the upper part of the hill. The house is built on a hill that sloped down to a creek, which we call the gully. But and so that since the floor was level, the back part of the house was up about 3 feet off the ground, or maybe more. So we used to play under the house. That was a place we had toys and made imaginary houses and so forth under the house. So that's how we used to say it, under the house. And then, of course, when my sister was born, then at that time, right after about the time she was born, Dad decided to get a cow, and so he built a pen for her in the back part of the house, right along the gully, and and bought a Jersey cow. And so part of my job when I was, well, almost immediately, but part of my job was to pick up the manure and yeah, from the yards, because the cow's name was Betty, and Betty would get tied out into the yard so that she could graze. And so, but part of the deal was this was in the neighbors' yards, so I would have to go pick up every Saturday, go pick up the cow pies and put it. Well, where we put it was in a pile under a big oak tree, which turned out to be over time a fantastic place for the development of earthworms, and all the fishermen in town knew about it, and that was one of my ways of making a little bit of pin money. Well, I didn't make money. They would give me money if they felt like it. So they would come with their buckets, and we'd go out, get the pitchfork, and go dig up as many worms as they wanted. And some of the generous ones would tip heavily, like 10 cents, and the others would maybe give me a nickel. But we also had rabbits in hutches and chickens. And so my other job was to clean under the rabbit cages every Saturday. And we had neighbors, and we played and rode bikes and the like.
What about your school days?
I have very pleasant memories of that. We lived about maybe 4 blocks, the equivalent of 4 city blocks from the school where I went. And I started school when I was 5, well, a little more than 5 and a half. And so I was one of the youngest ones in the school. I just barely, in my class, I just barely was old enough to start school at 5 and a half. And but I would walk to school and walk back home for lunch every day. And it was nothing considered very unusual about that, because there were usually other kids walking, and I did that. And some days I'd be walking home for lunch, and if I were lucky, I'd coincide with Dad coming home for lunch, so I would get a ride for the last 2 blocks instead of having to walk the whole way. And then when I was in 5th grade, which was the year we moved, I had just started riding my bike to school. The bike was really a little big for me, but I could manage it most of the time.
Did you, as you got older, participate in clubs or have a part-time job or outside school activities?
Well, once I got to high school, yes, I didn't do. There wasn't much in the way of activities in grade school, but in high, well, I shouldn't say that. There was a 4-H club that I was in, but I wasn't very active in 4-H. But by the time I got to high school, I joined FFA. I was taking the agricultural curriculum, which was 4 years of ag classes, and almost all the ag students would join FFA. And I was very active in that. I was the treasurer for 1 year, and then president of our chapter in my senior year. That was my main activity. We had a small dairy when I was in high school, and my dad was still working as a carpenter. So it was my job to start the milking. And so I couldn't stay for after school activities. So I had to go home on the bus and start the milking. And in the mornings, I didn't ride the bus in the morning either because I could barely make it in time. So Dad was usually, he'd after we'd finished the milking and clean up, and I'd ride into town. He'd take me to town to the to school. So activity-wise, it was just the 4-H, I mean the FFA activities, and I was quite active. I showed cattle and well, basically cattle. Also would take chickens to the livestock show, but that was kind of on the side. And I was very successful. My last year, I had my Holstein heifer and had become a cow, and we took some grand champions and in the local fairs, and we participated in the state livestock show in the districts and so forth. So I was quite active in that.
Was education emphasized in your family?
Absolutely. Yes. My mother and dad had finished high school, and they were the only ones in their families who had finished high school. So both of them had finished high school, and they finished at the time during the Depression. So there was never any question about whether or not they would do anything but, well, my mother get married or help at home until she got married, and Dad went to work. So there wasn't any college, but they always had in mind for me to go to college. And when my sister finished high school, she wasn't as strong a student as I had been, and so my folks were saying, but there was a very, very good vocational school in our town, and so she wanted to be a secretary, and they had a very strong secretarial program, so they wanted her to go to trade school, and I convinced them to let her go to send her to the same college I had gone through, which was in Lafayette, the university. It turned out to be the University of Louisiana in Lafayette. What's its name now? So they had a 2-year secretarial program, which would be the equivalent today of an AA. And so she went to that, and I think she got it. Well, I know she got a much better, much more rounded kind of education there, which served her very well. So yes.
So did you always sort of know that you'd be going to college, or was there a decision point for that?
I think I always knew I'd go to college. As to what I'd go to college and be. My mother wanted me to be she wanted me to be a teacher. I had reasonable math skills, and so she always thought I'd be a math teacher. But when I did go to college, by then I was heavily vested in the agriculture, and I sort of started out very briefly in dairy science, and then decided that I didn't want to go that route, and kind of just said, I had been working briefly with in the agronomy department in their greenhouses and stuff. So I said, okay, agronomy, and it turned out to be a very, very good choice.
How did you envision your future at that time?
I don't remember. I mean, I guess after a while it was, there was no big plans. The idea was to get something and see what would show up at the end of the time.
And what happened?
Well,
college.
Well, in my last year, my advisor at Southwestern, my agronomy soils, he was a soils professor, encouraged me to apply to graduate school, which I did, and was accepted and given an assistantship at the University of Illinois. So at the ripe old age of 17 and a half, I struck out on my own to the cold north and got my master's in agronomy, in soils, basically. Well, it was an agronomy department, but my work was in soils.
And from there, you went on to...
Well, story's a little complex there. When I was at, I'll be saying Southwestern, because the University of Louisiana Lafayette at the time that I started was called Southwestern Louisiana Institute. In my senior year, the name was changed to the University of Southwestern Louisiana, and it was that for many years until the administration convinced the legislature to let them use the University of Louisiana name. But so I will call it Southwestern because that's what we all called it at the time. So at Southwestern, I was very active in campus clubs. I was president of a little ag fraternity. I was president of the College of Agriculture, which made me a member of the student council for the university, and the Newman Club for Catholic students. And we had a very, very strong Newman Club. I served as a vice president, and I served as president. The club had I don't know, maybe 700 or 800 members, and the university, the whole school, had a population of probably 4,700. So it was a very major club on the campus. All that to say is that I was involved in the Newman Club, and the club was very mission oriented, and so it was at that time, which would have been in the late 1950s, the Peace Corps had popped up, and the Pope John Paul John the 23rd had made a call for the Church of the United States, the Catholic Church, to send missionaries to Latin America. So a program was developed called Papal Volunteers for Latin America. And so I had that in mind. And while I was doing my master's, I decided to become a volunteer after I got my master's. And so I did that, went for 2 years as a volunteer in Mexico, and went to language training school in Cuernavaca, Mexico, and then spent a year and a half after that working in young adult education and kind of agricultural extension with the farmers of small farmers in Mexico. So I don't know where I don't know where that's the background on that question.
And was that the end of your higher education?
No, after the time in Mexico, I went back to get my PhD and went to Oklahoma State University, and again in soils. And as I went there, I went there at the same time, concurrent with my going there, I got married just as I was starting to Kathy, my wife of now 53 years. She too was a volunteer, and we had met there in language school, and we got married after we finished our time in Mexico and went to Oklahoma State. And I was there 3 years.
And what year would that have been when you finished at Oklahoma State?
I finished in 1969.
I'm realizing I forgot to ask your date of birth.
No, you did. It was January
Did I?
2nd, 1940. Right, one of the
Nin-
first things.
1940. I did do that. Good. That's important. Okay, so here you are in Gainesville, Florida. How did that happen?
Well, there were other stops in between. After I got my PhD, I worked in Central America, Honduras and Costa Rica for 6 years with Standard Fruit Company growing bananas and pineapples. I was there first in research and then in agricultural services, which was kind of quality control for our agricultural practices. And then after 6 years, and we had young children, decided that I wanted to come back to the States where the education possibilities were better. And so I got a job first at with the University of Florida at Glade as sugarcane extension specialist. And then I was there for 4+ years, almost 5 years, and then came to Gainesville in the soils department. But that's how I got to Gainesville, with a stop in Glade, and that's where I was sugarcane extension specialist, and as such was involved with the Sugarcane Technologist organization that we started out talking about.
Okay, so that brings us to the topic of our conversation. Is there anything else about your earlier life that you'd like to add that we didn't talk about?
Can't think of it now. Probably bored you already.
Well, let's go on then to, actually, that's never a possibility with this. So whatever you say is wonderful. So let's go on then to talk about your experience with the organization in question. What is the Society of Sugarcane, American Society of Sugarcane Technologists?
Well,
how did you fit in?
I fit in because the society is made up of people working in sugarcane, and both in the production of it and in the manufacture of sugar from the sugarcane. So there's sort of two sections. They were called sections, actually. There was what they call the manufacturing section and the agricultural section. Well, I was a sugarcane extension specialist, which meant that I was stationed at Glade, and I would work with the county agents and with the sugarcane farmers as a conduit for the research and information that the university was putting out for the production of sugarcane in Florida. The American Society of Sugarcane Technologists really had only two sections. It was the Louisiana section and the Florida section. At the time, Florida was producing more sugar than Louisiana, although traditionally Louisiana had always, I think most people think of Louisiana as the place where the sugarcane was grown, but they had grown it there much longer than Florida. But Florida has been in the sugarcane business for about a century now. So after the industry had expanded very rapidly after 1960, when Cuba, we had an industry before. They were growing sugarcane here since I think 1920s. And it's major corporation, U.S. Sugar Corporation, and there were others too that were growing sugar. But in 1960, when Cuba got closed off, suddenly there was that source of sugar for the United States was closed off, and simultaneously, many of the Cuban refugees that came to Florida had been in the sugar industry. So almost immediately, the sugar industry expanded rapidly. There was the market, and there was the know-how was there, and so that's that's what we were. That was the group that we were working with, and as a university person, they kind of looked at us and looked for some leadership there, and so I was the secretary treasurer of the organization. We had annual meetings where papers were presented, and it was a real important aspect of the group, because it was a fairly tightly knit group, and so we felt it was very important to be participating in leadership roles.
Do you have any idea of the number of members that were involved? Well, that there were.
I would say on the eyes, been a while, but I would think about, we had probably 300 or so members from Florida, and that consisted of people working in the sugar mills, from supervisors all the way down to people, the engineers who were running the mills, and the agricultural area had all the field superintendents and people who are doing the agricultural practices would have been members. And then from the university side, we had all the researchers, and also there was a group from the USDA research station at Canal Point for sugarcane. The USDA has 2 sugarcane experiment stations, one in here and one in Louisiana. It's located in where is it? It's in Canal Point near Pahokee, right on the Lake Okeechobee, and the others in Louisiana. But when the technologists with the annual meetings were a joint meeting with Louisiana, so that was made it very important for communication between the groups and exchange of ideas and research, and then there was a lot of socializing that went on. So it made it very convenient to pick up the phone and call somebody that you knew from somewhere else because you had met them at the meetings, and it was we felt it served a very, very good purpose.
What years are we talking about?
That would have been 1975 to 1980.
And at that time, who was your employer?
I was employed by the University of Florida, and I was stationed at the experiment station at Glade, which was called the EREC, Education and Research Center at Glade. And I was a state extension specialist located there. So technically speaking, I had responsibility across the state, but it was all of the sugarcane was located in 3 counties, or 4 if you counted a little bit in Martin County. So it just made sense not to be located in Gainesville, as most of the state specialists were located. And later on, how I ended up in Gainesville, when I left that job, I came to the campus here in Gainesville with the soils department as a soils extension specialist. So I technically changed departments, but that's how I was at Glade, and worked with the people at Canal Point, where we also had a University of Florida faculty member there, the sugarcane breeder.
Okay.
Oh, by the way, this is a total aside. By the way, that sugarcane breeder at that time was Paul Lyrene, and historians might know him today. Paul Lyrene is very well known in the world as a blueberry breeder. He's developed many of the blueberry breeds that are varieties that are used in Florida and other parts of the world. But I worked with Paul Lyrene as a sugarcane man.
So your connection with society or this Sugarcane Technologists, what was your role with them?
Basically, I was the executive secretary. I had collected the dues, sent out notices, arranged for the meetings. We had, I forgot to say, we also had now I'm gonna have to think about this. I think we used to have, yes, we had just a Florida section meeting. We had a Florida section meeting once a year, and we had what we call the national meeting, which was joint with Louisiana. So we had 2 meetings a year, and the arrangements for those locations and the, setting up at the hotels and sending out all that, those are the things I did. There was an executive committee, but the nitty gritty work was what I did with them, and kept the rolls.
So what was that experience like for you?
Well, it was a very good experience. Of course, it gave me prominence because all of the members knew me, and that was helpful in communicating with them in terms of the technical aspects that I would do. So there was a certain level of respect that was there. So that helped in that way. And I think I did a pretty good job.
What are some memorable times or activities, events that you remember?
The meeting with the joint meeting was always a lot of fun, because it was kind of interesting. The agreement had been that the Louisiana section would choose the site one year, and then the next year it would be the Florida section. But as it worked out, they just loved to come to, help me, Kathy, where was it? They loved to come to Fort Walton Beach. And so we said, oh, okay, we'll go to Fort Walton Beach every year. So they would come from Louisiana to Florida, and we'd travel the length of Florida to get to Fort Walton Beach. And it would take us longer to drive there than it took them. So the readings usually were over the weekend. There was a gathering get together, mixer on Friday night, and then the meetings would be all day Saturday, the technical meetings, and maybe a little bit of some, farewell gathering on Sunday. But it was an all day, it was a weekend thing. Well, we'd get to Fort Walton Beach, and the Louisianians, who were mostly Cajuns, because the sugarcane country in Louisiana is in South Louisiana, they had been there partying and swimming in the pool and had had a few drinks before we got there. So we'd get there all tired, and so it was always a party. And then we got down to business. As far as the other things, our meetings, we had we would look around in the state, and we would go and visit usually with the president. I'd go with the president, try to figure out a place to have it, and we'd get wined and dine for a little bit. I don't know if you want to put that on the record.
So was it all fun?
It was not all fun. No, as I said, we put out a proceedings every year. So the proceedings of the papers that were given at the meetings were then written up and had to be reviewed and sent to the printer, going through the review process and get them. So there was a very important record of the work that had been done over the years. So the proceedings of the American Society of Sugarcane Technologists was the principal place where the sugarcane research in the U.S. was published. Occasionally that'd be specific, some things that would be published in the agronomy journals and so forth, but for the most part, the practical everyday stuff was useful stuff was in the proceedings of the society, and that was one of the jobs of the Secretary Treasurer, to see that that got done along, help the editors out. But since the Secretary Treasurer tended to be a more have a longer tenure in that job than the editors, the continuity was held by the Secretary Treasurer.
And how long was that tenure for you?
The whole 5 years that I was there. As soon as I got that, the person that had it before was very anxious to get rid of it and the job, and I got slipped in, and it was good for me because it gave me immediate access to a lot of people, and the recognition that helped me do my job as an extension specialist.
So it was a benefit to you at that time in your career and personally.
Absolutely, yeah. Because I was new to the university system. I had worked in industry, but not in the university, and so recognition and credit towards tenure was to show that you're recognized and know what you're doing was nice to have.
So was there any downside to this work that you did with them?
It was work, but no, I don't think so. Except for, it did take time, and from the work, but it was so closely related to what I did. It was not really that much of a down. There was not a downside to it.
And was your family supportive of the time you spent on that beyond your paying job?
I don't think they knew the difference, because I did the work for the society concurrent with my other work, and so when I was there at Glade, I didn't live in Glade. I lived on the coast near West Palm Beach, so I commuted to Glade each day in a carpool. So they knew that I left, and they knew that I came back, and there was a little bit of a benefit, because when we went to the national meeting in Fort Walton Beach, they usually got to go to the beach with me. So I don't think they felt any time away, any more time than was normal.
So you talked about Glade. Can you describe what that was like, that area?
Well, the station is in the Glades, and it's just thousands of acres of muckland. The sugarcane, almost all of it at the time, probably 95% of the cane was grown on muck at the time that I was there. That has changed since then, but so you just have, as far as you can see, is when there's no cane growing is black soil, and when there's cane growing, you can see cane growing, and it's very flat, so you can't see very much when you're on the road, because the cane is usually higher than the eye is. But Glade has a rather bad reputation of being a rather very rural and kind of a closed society there. At the time that I started to work there, there wasn't any housing to be had. They had just had a mandate, or what do you call it? They couldn't build any new housing until they improved their wastewater system, their sewage system. It was in the early days of environmental awareness, and so I think it was EPA had said, okay, you can't, you got to improve your system. So that's why there was no housing to be had, and we went over to the coast to live. As I was saying about the muck land, the organic soil, the muck, has been subsiding forever, and as soon as it was drained, and so there's less muck now than there was, and so a lot of the cane has expanded onto the surrounding sandlands. So that's an aside from, it's not that the sand, Belle Glade is in the muck area, right smack in the middle of the whole muck area.
So it sounds like your work, your University of Florida's job and your work with the society were quite intertwined. What kind of people were you working with in that area at the time?
I would working with either most of them would be the superintendents at the mill, who were the mill engineers, the ones who were cooking, I guess you want to say, cooking the sugar down, taking care of the wastes, and also in the agricultural area would have been the farm managers, who were seeing to the agricultural practices of water control and insect control and planting and all those things, and fertilization was big. So those were the people that I have been working with.
And were they mostly people with technical educations?
Yes, many had, well, they all at least high school graduates, and some had a lot of experience, and then there were college graduates too that were there. Yeah, that would have been pretty much the ones who would have been members of the society, were the supervisory level people. And then, of course, the mill owners and so forth, they were also members of the society, but the working members were the ones who were more like at the supervisory level. And
can you describe your role in working with them?
No, I'm tired.
Okay, that sounds like we should be bringing this to an end. But I think I have a few questions that I'd just like to pick up on that you mentioned before. You mentioned the word Cajun, which is, could you explain that as part of your story?
Well, I am one. So Cajuns are people of usually French descent, and in South Louisiana, and they're the far descendants of the Acadians who came from Canada, but and they were exiled, as many people know that the story of exile from Nova Scotia and so forth. This was in oh boy, in the 1750s. But Cajuns, the Cajun culture, which persisted in South Louisiana for many years, was so persistent that my grandparents were still speaking French. They did not speak English, but they were there, had been there for I think like 8 generations. And in the meantime, although the basis they were French speaking people, they were pretty well mixed by then with Italians and Germans and Scots and who knows what, Spanish. The name Kidder is an English name. Best I can figure is there was an Englishman that ended up in South Louisiana in the late 1700s. And now it's one of the very, very Cajun name in South Louisiana. So Cajuns are mixed. They're of that group of people who lived in South Louisiana, and that's where the cane is grown. So that's where that came into the conversation.
Okay, thank you for letting me add that little PS. Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you would like to record before we terminate?
Can't think of anything.
Okay, in that case, I want to thank you again for being willing to record your experiences, and we really appreciate your adding that to our archives of oral history.
Glad to do it. Thank you.
I will now end the interview.
Bye.